Welcome to what turns out to be part 3 of the Era of Good Feelings. In this episode, we'll be taking a look at Northern industrialization and some political developments. You see, what's happening in the United States, as you can tell from the map, is that two distinct economic patterns are developing. In the North, and specifically dominated by New England, you see the rise of manufacturing and textile factories. And in the South, they're going to stay pretty much based on an agrarian way of life dominated by the planter elites. Now, looking at New England, as more factories are opening and bringing workers to the factory, they're replacing what's called the domestic system, the old style where entrepreneurs might bring the raw materials to a woman's home, and she might spin it and weave it into some sort of cloth, and then the entrepreneur would pay her for her work. Much more slow and tedious, probably better quality, but as we industrialize, quality isn't always the bottom line. It's making profit, so making things quickly and cheaply becomes more important. And one of these early factories was started by Francis Cabot Lowell in 1814, and it was a textile factory in New England, and they hired New England women. They kind of left the farm and would go to work in this mill, and it was almost like a rite of passage. It was a way for them to go out on their own, make a living, earn some money, save money for a future marriage that she could kind of bring with her to the marriage. And then once she did get married, she'd leave, with her husband and go start their new life. But as these women came to this factory, they kind of experienced some independence. A lot of times, as they lived in the boarding houses at the factory town, they would be overseen by a motherly figure, some elderly woman who kind of, fed them and made sure that they tended their manners and, learned their ways and whatnot. So, but as time goes on, more is going to be expected of these women. Conditions will deteriorate, pay will go down, demands will go up, and the overall satisfaction level decreases. And so many of these New England women eventually, even though they had tried things like forming labor unions, they had kind of developed their life in these boarding houses to where speakers would come in and they would, practice poetry and even publish some of their own newspapers in the mill town. Eventually, they get tired of this increasing, demands placed upon them and the deteriorating working conditions, and eventually they'll be replaced by immigrants. Specifically, kind of the Irish immigrant women will take their place because they're usually willing to work for less money in worse conditions simply to try to have a job. And then when we contrast the New England textile factories, obviously in the South, the revolution that changed life down there, as I had mentioned before, was Eli Whitney's cotton gin, invented in 1791. Now, whereas the picking of cotton was a tedious, hard task, when this invention is created, the output that each slave can produce each day skyrockets. And therefore, it makes slavery more profitable because slaves can now pick the seeds out of the cotton much, much more quickly. And in fact, what effect this will have is it really kind of spurs on the growth of slavery as it kind of had been slowing up to this point. Another thing that it does is that plantation owners will start looking for new lands, especially as their land starts to lose its nutrients. And so they tend to move further south and west, taking slavery with them. And even with their cotton production in the South, they do kind of feed into the northern textile factories, for it is their cotton that's being sent north to be made into these cloths. However, the economy does take a turn for the worse in what becomes known as the Panic of 1819. Now, those people who had opposed the rechartering of the U.S. Bank, many of them would blame the Bank of the United States as kind of causing this problem, hoping to eventually kill the bank. But some of the causes that led to it was the fact that we see rampant inflation, There's a great deal of land speculation and people getting easy credit. All the while, banks start to call in their loans because they don't want to lose out on collecting their money. And so what we see is kind of the end of the post-war boom left from the War of 1812. And this will kind of challenge domestic peace and prosperity, and eventually as we try to fight and combat the problems that it created. But as I had mentioned in a previous episode, this is still the era of good feelings, and it's still dominated by the Democratic Republicans. And James Monroe, as you see, easily wins re-election. Obviously, the Federalist Party is done. John Quincy Adams does garner one electoral vote, but this does give Monroe 4 more years as president. And that all now brings us to the issue of slavery, something that will come to dominate politics from now all the way up to the Civil War. Now, some of the characteristics that you see, some of the trends is that with the rapid growth of population in the North, they had a majority in the House. And then in the Senate, there was 11 slave and 11 free states, so they had equal number of senators there. But what happens is in 1820, Missouri is going to petition to enter the Union as a slave state, and that would upset the balance. But Henry Clay, the great compromiser, helps pass what becomes known as the Compromise of 1820 or the Missouri Compromise. And what that does is it allows Missouri to enter as a slave state. It also allows Maine to enter as a free state, thereby keeping that balance of free and slave states. But as you can see, it also outlaws slavery in the rest of the Louisiana Territory north of 3630, thereby kind of limiting where slavery is supposed to be able to spread. Now, this will be changed later on. However, many people think that it's a good compromise and will kind of keep the peace. But Thomas Jefferson, our old president and author of the Declaration of Independence, was quoted kind of saying it was just a fire bell in the night. He knew that the issue of slavery wasn't going to go away, and we're just kind of postponing it till a later date and time. But in one of his most lasting legacies, James Monroe does issue the Monroe Doctrine in 1823. Now, it was written largely in part by John Quincy Adams. But during this era of good feeling, there was this spirit of nationalism and unity and harmony inside the United States. And we kind of took that to our foreign policy a little bit. Now, in his Monroe Doctrine, it kind of had 3 tenets. One, it stated that there should be separate spheres of influence. The United States will deal with the Western Hemisphere, of which Europe should not interfere, and therefore then we would promise to kind of stay out of European affairs. Number 2, it talked about how countries should take a non-colonization policy, trying to discourage European countries from coming over to Latin America to further their empires. And 3, that these countries should take a non-interventionist attitude. Now, some of these ideas actually go as far back to Washington's farewell address, but what Monroe and Adams were hoping was that it would create better ties between the U.S. and the newly independent Latin American countries. However, needless to say, Europe wasn't really impressed, and they took little note of kind of what was going on with this Monroe Doctrine. However, it does become one of the main pillars of U.S. foreign policy when dealing with the Western Hemisphere. But finally, as we near the end of the era of good feeling, what we see is in the election of 1824, with the Federalist Party long gone and no one Democrat-Republican candidate, but a whole slate of them, what we see is that Andrew Jackson, if you notice, has a plurality, not a majority, but a plurality, which means he has more than the rest when it comes to both popular vote and electoral vote. However, he doesn't win the election. and it's because nobody has a majority of electoral votes that it gets turned over to the House to decide the winner. Now, as they go through their process, Henry Clay, in the middle of your screen there, basically throws his support to John Quincy Adams on the right, and that eventually persuades the House to declare John Quincy Adams the victor in this election. And that leaves Andrew Jackson, our old war hero, absolutely furious. And he's one to never forget. And therefore, he sets his eyes on the election of 1828, where he'll get the last laugh by defeating John Quincy Adams. However, this election does get the nickname the corrupt bargain because Jackson and others believe that Clay and Adams had kind of worked hand in hand to steal the election from Jackson. And therefore, we kind of see the end of the era of good feelings.